The number was 24,140 pounds. I got it on a Tuesday morning in July at the co-op scale outside Carrick, the one they use for hay trucks, and the kid in the booth printed the ticket and handed it out the window without looking up. I folded it in half and put it behind the visor clip with the insurance card. For about 3 months I was proud of that ticket. I'd take it out and look at it the way you'd look at a photograph. What I should have done, and what I want to say plainly before I say anything else, is drive around to the other side and get the axles weighed separate. The pads were right there. It's 4 extra minutes and it's free if you already paid for the ticket. But I had the total, and the total is the number that sounds like something. And I was 58 years old and pleased with myself, so I took my ticket and went and got a sandwich. Our coach was rated at 22,000 pounds gross. It says so on a sticker inside the driver's door, in letters small enough that you have to crouch. So I was 2,140 pounds over before a single one of the people who ended up living in that vehicle had set foot in it, before the water tank was full, before the Pryors, before Saul and Milo, before the dog. Everything that happened to us later, everything I got wrong and everything I had to undo with a grinder in the cold, was already written on a piece of thermal paper behind the visor, and I read it every week for 3 months and never once understood what it said. I want to tell it in order, though, because the order is the only part of it that makes any sense. Dell and I bought the coach together in the spring of 2019 with money that came out of the end of the Verlin Plastics plant in Ohio. She'd been the shipping clerk there for 19 years, and I'd been quality control on the extrusion line for 26. When the announcement came, they gave us a number, and the number was smaller than people expected, and there was a lot of talk in the parking lot about lawyers that never turned into lawyers. Dell came and found me at my truck and said, "I'm not paying rent on a house I sit in alone. What are you doing?" We weren't married, and we weren't ever going to be. People assumed for years, and we quit correcting them because correcting them took longer than letting it go. She'd been widowed in 2011. I'd been divorced twice, which is its own kind of report card. What we had was a bank account with 2 names on it and a title with 2 names on it, and a rule that neither of us signed anything for the other one. The coach was a 1997 34-feet gas engine on a Ford chassis, and we paid $19,500 for it from a widow in Findlay whose husband had kept every receipt in a shoebox. It had a stripe down the side that had gone the color of weak tea. Dell called it the Roadhouse from about the 2nd week because the carpet was the color of a bar floor, and because she said if you're going to live in something, you might as well name it something you can say out loud in front of strangers. For 4.5 years, we lived in it full time and made a living the way a lot of people do out there, and nobody notices, camp hosting from May to September at a reservoir in eastern Oregon, 30 hours a week each in exchange for a site and a small check. Sugar beet harvest in the fall, which is 3 weeks of night shifts, standing in a pile of dirt getting paid well enough to matter. A stint at a fulfillment warehouse in the winter with 200 other rigs parked in a gravel lot with the generators running. Then back around. We ran the same loop every year, roughly 240 miles across a triangle of high desert and river valley and dryland wheat, and we knew every place in it where you could get water, where you could dump, where the county didn't care if you slept, and where they did. Dell kept the money. I kept the vehicle. That's a division of labor that works if both people respect it, and mostly we did. There was a dog, Roscoe. 41 pounds of mixed-up terrier and something with a bad temperament, 6 years old when we got him from a woman leaving a campground in a hurry. He cost us in ways I only added up later. 50 pounds of food is 50 pounds. A dog means you can't leave the rig closed up in August. A dog barks at the exact moment you need silence. And there is no training that out of a 6-year-old dog when you're the 3rd owner. Dell loved him. I did too, in a resigned way. He's part of the arithmetic, and I'm not going to pretend he wasn't. Now the part I have to explain honestly, because if I don't, everything after it sounds stupider than it was. In the fall of 2022, Dell was inside a store in Yakima buying a water filter, and I was 200 feet away asleep in the back, and somebody popped the entry door with a screwdriver and took a laptop, a jar of quarters, and Dell's late husband's wedding ring, which was in a drawer with the spare keys. I slept through it. That's the part that sat on me. I woke up because Roscoe was barking at nothing and the door was standing open and the road noise was coming in. And I lay there and understood that a person had walked through the space where I was sleeping, and I had not woken up. Then, in March of 2023, we got caught in a wind event on a stretch of open ground with nowhere to get behind. And we sat there for 6 hours while the coach rocked on its springs, and a piece of somebody else's awning came across the road and hit the side of us hard enough to leave a dent you could set a coffee cup in. Dell said, "This is a tin can with a steering wheel." She meant it as a complaint. I took it as an assignment. That summer, I bought a wire-feed welder at an estate sale in Pendleton for $220, along with a helmet and a half-empty spool of wire. And I taught myself to weld off videos on a phone with 1 bar of signal, in a gravel campsite, at 51 years of age in my head, and 57 on paper. I want to be clear that I was never any good at it. I got competent at laying down a bead that held. My welds looked like caterpillars. There's a difference between a weld that holds and a weld-a-welder would sign, and I had one and not the other, and I knew it, and I told myself it didn't matter because the loads were low. I worked on that coach for 8 months off and on, in campsites and behind a barn at a place we worked and in the corner of a warehouse lot with the security guy watching me over his coffee. Here is what I ended up with, roughly, and I'm going to give it in pounds because pounds are the whole story. Expanded metal screens over the 4 side windows and the windshield, hinged at the top so they'd swing up and latch so we could still get light. 290 pounds all told. A plate skirt along the lower sides and over the propane bay and the exposed underbelly, which was the biggest single item, 430 pounds. A cage over the rear ladder and the roof hatch, 61. A welded pipe bumper on the front, 154. Steel channel on the inside of the entry door and a real deadbolt through the frame instead of that plastic RV latch that a child could beat, 38 pounds with the reinforcement. Security film on the glass behind the screens, which weighs almost nothing but cost more than the steel. Interior brackets so we could bar the door from inside, 22. A rack on the back for 2 spare wheels, 71 pounds empty. And a lot more than that loaded. 966 pounds of steel, plus fasteners, plus paint, plus the tools to maintain it, plus the welder itself, which I kept because I'd need it, plus a second battery bank because now the coach was darker inside with the screens down and we ran lights more. Dell didn't fight me on it. That's important. She read the receipts, because she read all the receipts. And she asked me twice what it weighed, and I said I'd weigh it when it was done, and I did. And I told her 24,140. And she was quiet for a second and said, "That's over." I said, "It's over the sticker. The sticker's conservative. The chassis is stouter than the sticker." She said, "The sticker isn't a suggestion, Ray. It's what the springs and the brakes were bought for." And I said the thing I'd been saying to myself for 8 months. I said, "It's a home. Homes are heavy." She let it go. That's a thing about Dell I want on the record. She let it go because half of that vehicle was mine, and she believed that meant something, and she has never once since then said the words "I told you." She said other things. She never said that. There was a welder, a real one, named Dwayne Kittleson, who worked mobile out of a service truck and did our exhaust hanger that August. He walked the length of the coach with his hands in his pockets, looking at my work, and he said, "Who did this?" I said I did. He looked at a corner joint where I'd put down about 4 times the metal that was needed, and he said, "Your welds are ugly, but your idea's not dumb. You put the weight low and you put it where you can get at it. And most guys who do this put a bunch of angle iron up high and turn their rig into a top-heavy sail." Then he stood back and said, "I'd have used lighter gauge. You went thick because you didn't trust yourself." That's exactly what I'd done. He knew it in 90 seconds. I paid him for the exhaust hanger, and I thought about that sentence for 1.5 years. The first thing that was actually wrong, I want to say up front, was not a person, and it was not a sound, and it was not on television. It was a water spigot at the day-use area at Ivy Bar, on the county side of the river, 31 miles from where we parked most of that August. We'd filled our fresh tank there for 4 seasons. It was a 2-inch riser with a brass frost-free hydrant on it, and a concrete pad and a sign about not washing dishes. And it was, as far as we were concerned, one of maybe 6 places in our whole loop where you could put 100 gallons in a vehicle without asking anybody's permission. On the 28th of August, I backed the coach around to the pad and got out with the hose, and there was no hydrant. There was a patch of fresh crushed gravel about 2 feet across, raked smooth, and when I dug at it with the toe of my boot, there was a cut pipe with a cap on it, below grade. I want to explain why that stuck to me, because from the outside it's nothing. If they'd shut the water off, that's a valve. If it froze and broke, that's a repair somebody hadn't gotten to. If they wanted to keep RV people from filling up, they'd have put up a sign, because counties love signs. Cutting a pipe below grade and putting gravel over it is not maintenance, and it is not policy. It is somebody making sure a thing can't be turned back on by the next guy who comes along with a wrench. I stood there for a while with the hose in my hand. Then I coiled it up and drove 11 miles to the RV park at Cold Springs and paid $9 to fill, and I told Dell the county had finally gotten sick of us, and she said, $9 is $9, and put it in the book, and that was the end of it for about 2 weeks. Everybody wants to know at what point you knew. I've thought about it a lot. I think the honest answer is that I had the information 12 days before I did anything with it, and the reason I didn't do anything with it is that the information came in the form of things being missing, and people are not built to notice absence. We used an app. Most full-timers use 1 or 2. Ours was called Roadstead, and it was nothing but a map with pins on it that other travelers had put there, with photos and comments and dates. Dump station here, $12. Gate code is on the receipt. Potable water at the fire hall, ask first. Free overnight at this trailhead, 3 rigs max, no signs. It's a whole shadow infrastructure that exists only because 10,000 strangers keep it updated. And when I say it's the most reliable information system I have ever used in my life, I'm not exaggerating. Nobody has any reason to lie about a dump station. Starting around the 25th of August, pins started going gray. Gray means a user has flagged it closed or gone. 1 pin going gray is a Tuesday. A regional cluster going gray inside a week is not. I noticed it because I was looking for a replacement for Ivy Bar. In 4 days, I found that the Grange Hall at Mater had gone gray with the comment, spigot removed, same as Arlo. The transfer station outside Bickham had gone gray. Hose Bieb cut. A church that had let people fill for years, gray, no comment at all, which was worse. A truck stop on the highway had a new photo showing the water fill in the back lot with a chain and a padlock through the handle. And the dump station at the Fenwick County Fairgrounds, which had been open to the public since before I was born, had a photo somebody had taken on the 31st of August, showing a steel plate welded flat over the inlet. Not a lid, not a lock. Welded. I know what a weld costs. Somebody paid a man to come out to a fairground with a machine and permanently destroy a piece of public sanitation infrastructure. And they did it before anything had been announced to anybody about anything. I sat in the driver's seat with the phone and scrolled back and forth for probably an hour. And then I told myself a story that I still think was reasonable at the time. Every year there's a fight about vagrancy and people living in vehicles. Every year some county gets a complaint about somebody dumping a tank into a ditch. Water's been short 3 summers running. Somebody at the state level put out a memo about liability, and it filtered down, and now everybody's closing everything at once, because that's how bureaucracies move. All at once and in the same direction, and for no reason you can see from the outside. I told Dell that theory, and she said, "Then where's the sign?" She was right, and I didn't have an answer. So I said, the loop had maybe 2 more good years in it anyway, and we ought to think about a piece of ground somewhere. And we had a whole different argument instead, which is a thing people do. The boards were the second confirmation, and they were worse, because on the boards it was people and not pipes. There's a forum, has been for 20 years, where full-timers post. Real names are rare. People sign by rig. You'd see a post from somebody and it'd end with 34-foot gas, Class A, 2001, 2 adults and a cat, and that's how you knew who they were. I posted as 34-foot gas, 97, 2 adults and a dog. which tells you everything about me that matters, including that I'd never once thought about how I'd sign it. Around Labor Day, somebody in Nebraska started a thread called Anybody East of North Platte, and it filled up with people saying where they were. That happens after tornadoes and after wildfires. It's routine. What wasn't routine is that it didn't stop. By the 8th of September, the thread was 400 posts, and the map of it in my head was a line moving west. People would post about a county road being blocked with a truck and no sign of who put it there. People would post that a state park had emptied out overnight, and the host was gone and the host's rig was still there. Somebody posted a photo of an interstate rest area with the restroom doors screwed shut with plywood and the lot lights still burning at 9 in the morning. And the caption was just, "They left the lights on." That's the one that got me. That's the picture I kept going back to. Not because it was frightening on its face, but because I have worked in a facility. I know what it takes to shut a facility. You shut the lights off. Lights cost money and somebody's job is to shut them off. If the lights are on and the doors are screwed shut, then the shutting was not done by the person whose job it was. And people stopped posting. Not dramatically. There was no goodbye. There'd just be a name you'd seen for years, a 38-foot fifth wheel out of Cheyenne, 2 adults, and then there wouldn't be. Somebody eventually started keeping a list in a pinned post, and the list was rigs and lengths and the last date anybody had heard from them, and it got long enough that people stopped reading it and started only searching it for their own friends. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds in hindsight. At the time, it did not feel like the end of the world. It felt like a bad autumn with something going around, and the thing going around was being handled badly, which is how everything is handled. The radio said respiratory and behavioral. That was the phrase for about 10 days. A public health officer in a town of 9,000 said respiratory and behavioral presentation 4 times in one interview, and would not say anything else. And the interviewer, who was maybe 24, didn't know how to make her say more, and finally just thanked her. The clinic in Carrick put a laminated sign on the door that said, "No walk-in evaluations. Do not enter if symptomatic. Call from your vehicle." The number on the sign rang to a recording that told you to call a different number. The hospital 60 miles away went on diversion, which, if you've never worked around one, means they stopped accepting ambulances. And ambulances started driving further. And then they started not coming back to the county at all for whole shifts. School went to a 2-hour late start for 3 days for staffing, and then went remote. And then the district put out a note that they were suspending the meal delivery program because they couldn't staff the routes, which in a county like that is the actual emergency and nobody outside noticed. The gas station in Mater went card only, and then the card reader network went down for 2 days, and then they went cash only with a $40 limit per customer, which is nothing when your tank holds 75 gallons. And the co-op, where I'd been buying fuel for 4 years with a little plastic fob on my keychain, put a sign on the pump islands that said, "Account holders only. Farm accounts priority." My fob still worked because I'd had an account since the 2nd year, and I want to say plainly that the only reason we survived October is that in 2020, a woman named Roberta at the counter had talked me into filling out a form I didn't want to fill out. That's what the collapse looked like where we were, for 6 or 7 weeks. It looked like every service you don't think about going quiet in a particular order. And the order was the things maintained by volunteers, then the things maintained by counties, then the things maintained by companies with more than one location, and finally, the things maintained by one person who lived within 4 miles of it. Dell started keeping a list of what still worked. I want to be careful how I describe it because it wasn't a survival ledger. It was a shipping clerk's habit. She'd worked 19 years in a job where the entire point was knowing what was actually on the truck versus what the paperwork said. She'd say at dinner, 2 things came off the board today, and tell me which 2. The Pryors came to us on the 4th of October. Hollis Pryor was 71 and had been a rural mail carrier for 34 years in Idaho. His wife, Junie, was 69 and had a hip replacement in 2019 that had never gone right. and she walked with a wheeled walker and could do maybe 40 feet at a time. They had a 28-foot travel trailer and a Dodge to pull it with, and they'd been in the loop as long as we had. You see the same people, you share a fire twice a year for a decade, and you know their whole life. Hollis found us at the pullout by the grain elevator north of Carrick, which is where we'd been sitting for 11 days because it was flat and it was wide, and the elevator was shut for the season, and nobody came. He didn't work up to it. He was a mail carrier. Mail carriers talk to 400 people a week, and they get to the point. He said, "Ray, I've got $2,400 and I want to put it in your steel." I said, "What?" He said the Dodge had blown a head gasket in July, and he'd been nursing it, and it wasn't going to make the winter, and even if it did, that trailer had a single-pane window on each side and a lock you could open with a butter knife. And Junie couldn't get out of it in a hurry. And he'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks, and had come to the conclusion that they had one move left, and it was to make that move with people they knew. Then he said, "I'm not asking for charity. I'll pay in. I'd rather owe you money than owe you a favor." We talked about it for 2 days. Dell and I had it out one night in the front seats with the dog between us and the diesel heater ticking. Her position was that we couldn't feed 6 with what we had, and that Junie couldn't climb our steps, which is true. Our entry has 3 steps and a grab handle. My position was that we already knew we weren't going to say no, and the only question was whether we'd say yes in a way that we could live with in February. We said yes. I built a fold-out ramp for Junie out of the trailer's own frame material, which is the only piece of work I did that whole year that I'd still defend, and Hollis gave us $2,400 in hundreds out of a coffee can, and Dell wrote him a receipt on a page torn out of a legal pad, and both of us signed it, and Hollis folded it and put it in his shirt pocket like it was a banknote. The ramp weighed 68 pounds. Junie and Hollis together weighed about 330. Their belongings, after 2 full days of us being polite and then a 3rd day of us not being polite, came to about 410. They brought a chest freezer full of elk that we ran off the generator for 9 days until we admitted it wasn't sustainable and gave half of it away, which was the smartest thing we did in October, and I can't take credit because it was Junie's idea. Somewhere in there, I stopped doing the arithmetic in my head, because the arithmetic had started to be unpleasant. The night that convinced me I'd been right about everything was the 11th of October, and I have to tell it, because without it you'll think the choice I made later was easy. We were at the elevator pullout, the 5 of us and the dog. It was a Friday, and cold, maybe 34 degrees, and the wind was coming down out of the northeast the way it does. We'd run the generator to charge until about 8 and then shut it down. At around 1 in the morning, Roscoe went off. Not his mailman bark, not his coyote bark. A low one. We had a rule by then about lights, and everybody kept it. Hollis got Junie up against the interior wall away from the windows, and I got in the driver's seat and looked out through the gap under the screen on the windshield, which was down and latched, as it always was at night. There were 3 people on the road below the elevator. It was maybe a quarter moon, and they were shapes, and they were coming up the gravel toward us, and they weren't in a hurry, and they weren't spread out the way 3 people walking together are spread out. They were in a line, one behind the other, the way you'd walk on a trail. They came right up to the rig. 2 of them went along the driver's side, and 1 came around the front. The one at the front put his hands on the pipe bumper. I could see that much, and I could hear it, because steel tells you everything. And then whoever was on the side started going along the plate skirt, hand over hand, the way you'd feel your way down a hallway in the dark, and the sound of it came through the floor into my boots. They were at the entry door for what I later worked out was about 40 minutes. It was not a coordinated assault. Nobody kicked anything. It was more like weather. Something pushed on the door, steady, not violent, and the steel channel I'd put inside it flexed maybe 1/8 of an inch and made a sound like a tap on a radiator, and it did that over and over, and Junie held on to Hollis and Dell held the dog's muzzle shut with both hands, and I sat in the dark with my hands on my knees and understood something for the first time. They were not trying to get in. They were trying to get to us, and the door was in the way, and they didn't know the difference. They quit around 2:40 and went off the way they came. And about 10 minutes after that, we heard them get into the elevator office, which had a wood door with a glass panel in it. We heard the glass. Nobody slept. At first light, I went out and walked the whole vehicle, and there was not one thing wrong with it. There were smudges on the window screens at chest height and a scuff on the plate. That's it. And I stood there in the frost with the coffee, and I felt, honest to God, the best I have ever felt about anything I've done with my hands. And Hollis came out and stood next to me and didn't say anything for a minute and then said, "Well, worth $2,400. I want that on the record because of what I did to that vehicle 6 weeks later. The armor worked. It wasn't a fantasy, and it wasn't overkill, and it wasn't a man playing soldier in a campground. It did the exact job I built it to do, on the exact night I built it for, and 5 people are alive because of it, and I will not let anybody tell me otherwise. It also, at the same time, and for the same reasons, nearly killed all of us." The road closures started in the middle of October, and they were nothing like what people picture. Nobody set up a checkpoint. There was, as far as I know, no authority left in Fenwick County by then in any organized sense. The sheriff's department had 5 sworn deputies before any of this, and one of them was over 60. What happened was that a county road crew, or what was left of one, went around and hung weight limit signs, orange diamonds with a black truck silhouette and a number. 10 tons, 8 tons, 5 tons on the little one over Beaver Creek. I understand exactly why they did it. Those bridges get inspected on a schedule, and the schedule had stopped, and somebody with a conscience and a liability streak did the only responsible thing available to him. He downrated everything he couldn't inspect and went home. It's the same instinct as the man who welded the fairground dump station. It's not malice. It's a person doing the last piece of his job on his way out the door. For a 12-ton vehicle, it was the end of the world. I want to lay out what our loop actually was, because otherwise the rest of this is just words. Our territory, once the highways got unreliable, was a rough triangle. On the west, the river and the 2 bridges across it. On the north, the wheat ground and a county road that ran along a ridge. On the east and south, the grade up out of the valley, which is called the Sheelin on the maps and which climbs about 1,100 feet in 4.5 miles with a hard bend 3/4 of the way up. Inside that triangle there were, by the 1st of November, 4 places we could get water, 2 places we could get fuel, 1 place we could get propane, and about 6 places we could park a 34-foot vehicle overnight where we could see in every direction and get out in 2 directions. The Nadeau Bridge got posted at 10 tons on the 17th of October. That took out the west side. 10 tons is 20,000 pounds. We were, with people and water and freezer and Hollis's tools, somewhere around 25,500. I stood in front of that sign for a long time. There was nothing wrong with that bridge that I could see. It looked exactly the way it had looked the week before. It was a concrete deck on steel stringers over about 90 feet of brown water, and I had crossed it maybe 400 times. And I did the thing every heavy hauler in the world has thought about, and most of them have the sense not to do, which is I stood there and calculated the odds of a bridge posted by a man who never inspected it actually failing under a vehicle that was 2.5 tons over the posting. Dell came up beside me and said, "Don't." I said, "It's a number some guy wrote on a form." She said, "Yeah, and so is the 22,000 on our door, and you've been ignoring that one for a year, and now you want to ignore his too." She let that sit. Then she said, "You know what the difference is? If you're wrong about our sticker, we get a bad ride and a repair bill. If you're wrong about his, we're in the river with Junie in the back." We turned around. It cost us 51 miles that day. 2 days later, we finally got the axle weights. There's a scale at a defunct rock quarry off the Ridge Road, and it still had power because it's on the same meter as a well pump somebody was still using, and it has individual pads. I'd driven past it 200 times. Hollis suggested it, actually, because he'd delivered mail to the quarry office for 9 years and knew the scale house was never locked. Front axle, 7,480 pounds, rated for 7,000. Rear axle, 18,320 pounds. Rated for 15,000. Total, with the 6 of us and about half a tank of water, 25,800. Dell looked at the numbers on the Scalehouse computer on a monitor from about 2004 with a sun-bleached screen, and she wrote them on her wrist with a pen because neither of us had paper, and she didn't say anything on the walk back out to the rig. She got in the passenger seat and sat with her hands in her lap. Then she said, "The rear is 3,300 over. Ray, that's not a fudge factor. That's a fifth of the axle." I said the springs were holding fine. She said, "The springs aren't what I'm worried about. It's the brakes and it's the tires. You've got 6 tires on that rear rated for something, and there's 3,000 pounds sitting on them that nobody rated for anything." And then she asked me the question that ended the argument and started the winter. She said, "When did you put tires on it?" The tires on that coach were the tires that were on it when we bought it in 2019, minus one rear inner that had come apart in Nevada in 2021, which I'd replaced with a used one from a truck shop because we were in a hurry and short. I got out with a flashlight and read the date codes off the sidewalls, which is a 4-digit stamp, week and year. The 2 front tires, the steers, the ones that hold the whole vehicle in a line at 55 miles an hour, both said 4708. 47th week of 2008. They had maybe 40% of their tread and looked, to a person who didn't know better, perfectly fine. They were 15 years old. A truck tire is done at 7 regardless of tread, and everybody who has ever worked around them knows it. And I had known it, in the way you know a thing you've decided not to act on. Dell stood there and did the math out loud, which is the only genuinely cruel thing she has ever done to me, and I don't hold it against her because it needed doing. 6 steer-capable tires in the size we needed in 2023 mounted were running about $440 apiece. I had spent on steel wire gas for the welder, paint, fasteners, the security film, and the 2 extra batteries, right around $2,900 of our money, plus Hollis's $2,400, which had gone into the last of it and into the ramp and into diesel for the generator. I had spent, in other words, almost exactly the price of a full set of tires on making the vehicle heavier. Dell said, "You armored a vehicle you can't stop." Saul and Milo came to us on the 2nd of November at a fruit packing shed at the north end of the valley where we'd gone because Dell remembered they had a 2-inch water line and a hydrant in the yard. Saul Ferrante was 34 and had been a crew supervisor for an orchard outfit for 11 years, which in that valley means she knew every gate, every pump, every packing shed, every labor camp, and every person who had a key to any of it. Her brother Milo was 22 and had been going to community college in Yakima. Their mother had died in the first week of October in a way Saul described to me exactly once, in 7 words, and I'm not going to repeat them. They had a Corolla with 190,000 miles on it and 11 gallons of gas in a jerry can, and they had been sleeping in it for 9 days. We didn't debate that one very long, which tells you something about how fast a rule can change. Saul had a key to the shed and to 2 others like it, and she got us 300 gallons of water and about 90 pounds of culled apples that were still good in the first 4 hours we knew her. Milo could work all day, and did. The other reason we said yes is that Hollis said, before anybody else spoke, we were the ones standing outside a month ago, which nobody could argue with. So, 6 adults, 1 dog, 1 vehicle, 1 water tank, 1 propane tank, and a rear axle 3 1/3 tons over its rating. Saul and Milo brought maybe 90 pounds of belongings between them. That's what 9 days in a Corolla does. But 2 more adults is 310 pounds of people, and it's more food, and it's more water, and water is 8 1/3 pounds a gallon, and a full fresh tank on our rig is 70 gallons, which is 584 pounds of drinking water. And there is no version of this in which you carry less water. We crossed the quarry scale again on the 11th of November because I wanted to know and I was afraid to know. 26,920 pounds. Rear axle 19,100. That's the number that made the decision. Not the men at the door in October. Not the bridge. That. Here's the situation on the 15th of November. Laid out the way Dell laid it out to all 6 of us at once. Sitting in the coach with the screens down and one light on, because she said if we were going to do this, we were going to do it where everybody could hear it and nobody could say later that they hadn't been in the room. Fuel. We had about a third of a tank, call it 25 gallons, plus 18 in cans. The co-op in Carrick still had product and my fob still worked, and it was the only place left within reach that did. The gas station in Mater had gone dry on the 9th. The station at Cold Springs had product in the ground and no power to pump it, and nobody willing to do anything about that. Route. To get from where we were to the co-op, the direct way went over the Nadeau Bridge, which was posted at 10 tons. The only other way was up and over the Sheelan grade and around the head of the valley, which was 58 miles instead of 19, and which included 1,100 feet of climb and 1,100 feet of descent. Mileage. That coach, when we bought it at 18,000 pounds, got around 8.5 miles to the gallon on flat ground. At 27,000, it was getting 6.25, and on a grade it was getting numbers that don't mean anything because you're in second gear at 1900 RPM, doing 21 miles an hour with the temperature gauge 2/3 of the way over. So the trip to fuel cost us about 9.5 gallons round trip if nothing went wrong, out of the 25 we had, to buy however much the co-op would sell us, which by then was capped at 40 gallons per account per visit. That's survivable. That's not the problem. The problem was the descent. I had come down the Sheelan twice that fall at that weight, once loaded with 5 people and once with 6, and both times by the bottom I could smell the brakes and the pedal had gone long. Not gone, long. You push it further to get the same thing. Anybody who's driven anything heavy in hills knows the feeling and knows exactly what it means. I did not tell anyone that until that night. I'd told myself it was normal. It is not normal. Dell said, we can take weight off the vehicle or we can take people off the vehicle. Those are the two. If somebody's got a third one, I want to hear it. Nobody had a third one. Hollis said, then it's us. Junie said, Hollis, in a tone I'd never heard out of her. Hollis said, it's arithmetic, June. He turned to me and he said, you've got 2 people who can't work and can't run and can't get down the steps, and one of them is me now, and you've got a girl who can open every gate in this valley and a young man who can carry 100 pounds. If I'm sitting where you are, I know what I do. And Soul said, immediately, no, then it's me and Milo. We came last. That's how it goes. And Milo said, I'm not leaving. And Junie started crying, which she had not done once in 6 weeks. Not when they left the Dodge. Not any of it. I want to describe the next part carefully because it's the only thing in this entire account that I'm proud of, and I don't want to make it sound bigger than it was. I said, it's not people. Dell said, Ray. I said, it's not people, it's the steel. Dell said, that steel is the reason we're alive? She meant it. That's the thing. She wasn't arguing the other side to be difficult. She had been in the back of that vehicle in October with her hands around a dog's muzzle listening to somebody try the door for 40 minutes. And she knew precisely what the plate on the sides was worth. She said, we take that off and we're a tin can with a steering wheel again. Your words, my words, whichever. I said, we take it off and we can get up the hill and back down without cooking the brakes with 6 people in it. She said, and then what do we do at night? And I said the only thing I had, which was, we park where we can leave. That's the whole argument, really. That's everything. A fortress is a thing you stand in and refuse to move. Everything we had left depended on being able to move. Hollis said, how much does it come to? And I sat there and went around the vehicle in my head, piece by piece, and I said out loud, for the first time since July, 966 pounds of steel, and the rack, and the second battery bank, and the welder itself, and about 400 pounds of tools and spare parts, and a chest freezer that hadn't been cold in 5 weeks, and Hollis's elk that we'd already given away half of, and the 2 spare wheels on the back that were for a size we no longer wanted to be running on anyway. Call it 1,900 pounds. Dell did it faster than I did. She said, that gets the rear to about 17 too. Still 1,500 over, I said. That's the best we're going to do. And she said, after a while, all right. Then she said, you want to hear what I actually think? I think you built the right thing for the wrong problem. The problem was never getting in. It was getting out. We cut it off over 2 days, the 17th and 18th of November, at the pullout by the elevator, in 29-degree weather with an angle grinder run off the generator. I had not thought about what it would be like. 8 months of work comes off in 11 hours, which I suppose is the ratio for most things. The window screens were the worst because I'd hinged them, and hinges are a thing you do carefully, and I'd done them carefully. I cut the hinge pins first out of some idea that I might keep them and reuse them, which was a lie I was telling myself with my hands. Milo carried them out and stacked them along the fence in a row, all 4, and the light came into the coach differently, and Junie said, oh, when the first one came off, because she hadn't seen out of that window in 6 weeks. The plate skirt fought me. I'd overwelded every inch of it because I didn't trust myself, exactly like Dwayne Kittleson had said, and now I had to cut through 4 times as much metal as should have been there. Sparks in the grass. Milo held a fire extinguisher for 11 hours and never once complained. The pipe bumper came off in 20 minutes because that had all been bolted, and I remember standing there with the last bolt in my hand thinking, that's the one piece I did the easy way, and it's the only piece that's coming off clean, and there's probably something in that. I left the door. The steel channel inside the entry door and the deadbolt, 38 pounds, stayed, and stayed for everything after, and nobody ever suggested otherwise. I left the interior bars. I left the security film because film weighs almost nothing and because I'd paid more for it than for anything else. By the evening of the 18th, there was a pile of steel at the north end of the pullout that came up to my chest and was about 12 feet long. 1,916 pounds by my count, and I trust my count on that one because counting it was the only thing that kept me working. We didn't have anywhere to take it and no fuel to spare taking it anywhere. So we left it, and Saul said something that turned out to be true. She said, anybody comes by here is going to know exactly what happened. We crossed the quarry scale on the morning of the 19th, 24,980, rear axle 17,400. It was still over. It's always going to be over. But I got in that driver's seat and put it in gear and pulled out of the quarry yard. And the vehicle felt different in a way I could feel through the wheel in the first 50 feet. And I sat there with my jaws set and did not say anything to anybody for about 6 miles. The grade nearly finished us anyway. We went up on the 20th. Clear day, 26 degrees at the bottom, no wind, which is the only reason I tried it. I'd have waited another week if we'd had another week. We had 11 gallons. Going up is not the dangerous part. Going up you are just slow and loud has its own problems now. But the mechanical part of it is boring. Second gear, 21 miles an hour, temperature gauge climbing, everybody in the back not talking. Milo watched the mirrors. Saul read the temperature out loud every 2 minutes because I asked her to. Roscoe got sick on the carpet at the switchback and Dell cleaned it up while we were moving, which tells you what kind of person she is. We made the summit in 22 minutes, and I pulled off at the wide spot at the top and shut it down and let it sit for 45 minutes. And we all got out and stood in the cold and looked down at the valley, which is one of the great views in that part of the country and which I have never once been able to look at since without my stomach turning over. Getting to the co-op meant going down the other side, which is shorter and steeper. 3.5 miles, about a 7% average. One hard right-hander 2/3 of the way down where the guardrail is scraped in about 11 places, and then a run out to a T intersection with a stop sign at the bottom. I did everything right and it wasn't enough. I want that understood. I went down in the second. I never touched the brakes for more than 3 seconds at a time and I let it come back up between. I used the engine for everything the engine had. I have driven that hill probably 60 times in 5 years. At 18,000 pounds, you can do that hill in second gear all day and never warm the brakes past a nuisance. At 25,000 pounds with the geometry we had, second gear wasn't enough gear. The engine wouldn't hold it. It just kept building 1 mile an hour at a time, in a way that is not dramatic at all from the inside for the first minute and a half. I got to the hard right-hander at 41 miles an hour, which is about 15 over what that corner wants from a vehicle that shape. And I braked into it hard because there was no choice. And when I came out of the corner and put my foot back on the pedal to get us down to something sane for the run-out, the pedal went most of the way to the floor, and the vehicle did not slow down. There is a thing that happens in your chest. I'd never had it before. It's not fear exactly. It's more like your whole body going quiet to listen. I remember Saul saying my name once. There is a gravel arrestor bed on the Sheelin about 6/10 of a mile above the bottom, on the left, which is the wrong side, because it's built for the trucks coming down, loaded out of the wheat ground, and they set it where the runaway trucks were actually ending up in 1974. It's about 400 feet of loose pea gravel 3 feet deep in a berm-sided ramp that climbs about 8%. I've driven past that thing 60 times and thought about it every single time, because everybody who drives anything heavy does, and the thing I always thought was, if I ever have to use that, I'll have already made about 4 mistakes. That's exactly right. I'd made 4. I put us into it at somewhere between 50 and 55. I don't know, because I wasn't looking at the speedometer. I was looking at the entrance. And I remember thinking about the crown in the middle of the road and whether I could get across the oncoming lane. And there wasn't any oncoming. There hadn't been oncoming in 5 weeks. And that's the only reason we're alive. Gravel arrestor beds work. That's the news. It is the most violent thing I have ever experienced in a vehicle, and it is over faster than you'd believe. The front wheels dug and the whole thing pitched forward, and everything in that coach that wasn't bolted came into the front. And the noise is not a crash noise. It's a roar. And we went about 190 feet up the ramp and stopped. Dead, nose up, buried to the axles. Nobody was hurt. Junie had a bruise across her chest from the belt on the dinette that went purple and then green over 3 weeks. Dell bit through her lip. Milo's arm got opened up about 4 inches by a coffee can of fasteners that came off a shelf, and I'm not going to describe it beyond saying Saul had it closed and wrapped in 9 minutes with a first aid kit from the packing shed, and it healed fine. Roscoe was under the dinette and would not come out for 6 hours. We sat there. The engine was still running. I shut it off, and it got extremely quiet, and there was a smell in the cab of hot brake, which is a smell like a hairdryer and burnt paper, and the only sound was gravel settling. Hollis said from the back, "Everybody talk." So we talked. 1 at a time. That's a mail carrier for you. We were in that gravel for 3 days. Here's what nobody tells you about a runaway ramp. Getting into it is free. Getting out is not. That coach was buried past the hubs in loose gravel, nose up 8%, 12.5 tons, rear-wheel drive with an open differential, and the only thing behind it was more gravel and then a drop to the highway. You do not drive out. There is no version of driving out. You get dragged out backwards by something with a lot of low-end torque and a lot of weight of its own. And in the ordinary world, that's a heavy wrecker with a rotator, and it costs $3,000 and takes 2 hours. We had no phone service. We had a battery bank and a generator. We no longer had fuel to run much. We had 6 people, one of whom couldn't walk 40 feet, and we were 9/10 of a mile from the bottom of the grade, in the open on a slope, at the end of November, with no window screens and no plate skirt on the sides. That was the price. I want to be very clear that I understood it while it was happening. We took the armor off to be able to move, and then we couldn't move. And so we spent 3 nights in a naked vehicle in the most exposed place in the county. We saw people the first night, 4 of them on the highway below us, walking in the same single-file way, going down the hill. They didn't come up the ramp. There's no reason to think they knew we were there. We had no lights, no heat, no sound. We sat in the dark under blankets for 11 hours, and Dell held the dog, and I sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel out of pure animal stupidity, as though I could do anything. The second night was worse because it was colder and because we'd run out of the pretense that somebody was coming. Milo walked down to the co-op on the second day, which was 4.5 miles round trip, and found Roberta's son Dean there with a shotgun across his knees and about 900 gallons left in the ground. And Dean gave him 9 gallons of gas and 2 cans on my account, and told him there was a fellow named Kessler with a big 4-wheel drive tractor about 2 miles the other way who might pull us out and might not, and that Kessler didn't like people. Milo walked to Kessler's the 3rd morning. Weldon Kessler was maybe 65 and farmed about 2,000 acres of dryland wheat and had a Steiger articulated tractor from the 80s that weighed more than our motorhome by half. He came out in the afternoon with the tractor and a chain that was heavier than anything I'd ever put on that coach, and he backed up the shoulder and stood there looking at the ramp with his hands on his hips for a good 4 minutes without saying anything. Then he said, "How much does it weigh?" I said 25,000. He said, "You know that, or you're guessing." I said I knew it. I said we'd weighed it 11 days ago at the quarry. That's the only thing I said in that entire encounter that earned me anything. He nodded once, and after that he treated me like a person instead of like a tourist. It took him 1 hour and 40 minutes. He pulled us out backwards down the ramp in about 6-inch increments, stopping constantly, and twice he got out and had me get out, and we looked at how the rear axle was sitting, and once he made everybody get out of the vehicle and stand up the hill from it, which I thought was overcautious and which I now understand completely. When it was over and we were sitting on the shoulder of the highway with the engine running, he coiled his chain and said, "I don't want money." I said we didn't have much anyway. He said, "There's a pile of plate steel up at the elevator pullout." "That yours?" I said it was. He said, "It's about 800 pounds of 1/4 inch and some expanded metal." I said it was 1,900 pounds total and that 430 of it was the skirt and about half of that was 1/4 inch. And I could tell him within 20 pounds what every piece of it was. Kessler almost smiled. He said, "I'll take it all. I need to plate up a couple of loading chutes and a door on a shop." "You're not using it." I said no, we weren't using it. And that was the transaction. 8 months of work, $2,900 of our money, and $2,400 of Hollis's. And it bought us a tow off a runaway ramp from a wheat farmer who wanted material for a shop door. I helped him load it 2 days later. That's the part Dell says I didn't have to do. I did have to. I stood in the pullout and handed my own window screens up to a man on a flatbed trailers, one at a time, and he stacked them. And when we got to the pipe bumper, he said, "This is nice work." I said, "The welds are ugly." He said, "Everybody's welds are ugly." "It held, didn't it?" I said it held. He said then they weren't ugly, and drove off. Winter in the shape of what we have now. Our loop is 61 miles. It was 240 in the spring, and about 130 in October, and it is 61 now, and it's going to be shorter. It has 4 stops, and we picked every one of them for the same reason, which is not safety, and it took me until December to admit that out loud. We picked them because of turning radius. A 34-foot coach with a rear overhang needs a place it can get out of without a 5-point turn, because a 5-point turn takes 4 minutes and a person on the ground, and 4 minutes and a person on the ground is exactly what you don't have when you need to leave a place. So, the elevator pullout, which is a straight through with 2 ends, the quarry yard, which is huge and has 3 ways out, the packing shed lot at the north end, which Saul has the key to and which is a loop, and a wide spot on the ridge road above Motter where a road grader used to turn around, which is the only one of the 4 with a view in every direction, and which is where we spend most nights when the wind isn't up. We move every 2 or 3 days, not on a schedule because a schedule is a thing other people can learn, but often enough that no one place becomes ours. We are currently 7 vehicles doing roughly the same thing in roughly the same territory. That happened by itself. Nobody organized it, and nobody's in charge. And I want to be honest and say, I hope nobody ever tries, because the second somebody tries, we'll have meetings. There's a 5th wheel with a family of 4 in it that can't move without their truck, and so basically doesn't move. There's a converted school bus with 2 brothers in it who are the best equipped and worst-tempered people in the valley. There's a work van with a man in it we've never spoken to who parks 200 yards off from everybody every time without fail, and who left a case of canned peaches at the packing shed gate in December and drove away before anybody could come out. We have exactly 3 rules between the rigs, and they were arrived at by nobody in particular. No generators after dark. Don't park where somebody's already parked without asking. If you're leaving the valley, tell one person, so the list of who's still here stays true. That last one came from the forum, actually, from the way people used to sign their posts, and I think about that more than I'd like to. Hollis and Junie left us on the 4th of December, and I want to be accurate about it. They left, and it was Junie's decision, and it was made in daylight with everybody sitting down, and it took 2 days, and there was no drama. There's a woman named Ardith Spurley who was the camp host at the reservoir for 11 years before us, who's 78 and has 40 acres and a house with a wood stove and a hand pump on a shallow well, about 9 miles up the ridge. Junie could not do another 6 weeks of steps and a fold-out ramp and a bruise across her chest, and she said so. And she said it without making it about the ramp or about me, which she could have. Hollis shook my hand and said, "The receipt's still in my shirt pocket," which I understood to be a joke and also not one. We go up there every 8 or 9 days. They're all right. Ardith's got more firewood than she can burn and less food than she says she has, and we bring what we can. And Hollis has fixed about 9 things in that house that have been broken for a decade, because a mail carrier who can't drive a route has to do something with his hands. The last time we came up the lane, a man was there splitting wood who I didn't know, one of Ardith's nephews by marriage. And he watched us pull in, and he said, "You're the ones that cut the armor off." I said we were. He said, "Everybody knows that rig. You can see where it was. There's shadows on the paint." He's right, there are. Where the plate was bolted and welded along the sides, the paint underneath is the original color and everything around it is 15 years lighter, so the whole vehicle has a stripe down each side in the shape of what I took off. From a distance, it looks like a design. You can't hide what you used to be. I didn't expect that. Here's where we actually are, which is the part I think about at 4 in the morning. We have fuel for now, because a farm co-op with product in the ground and a man named Dean who honors an account number is a better institution than any government we've got left in that county. But the co-op has about a third of what it had in October, and there is no truck coming. We have water because Saul has keys, and because a 2-inch line off a well with a working pump is the single most valuable thing in the valley, and about 9 people know it exists. We have food into February and a plan for after that involving Kessler's wheat that I'd rather not describe until it works. We have no armor and we have not needed it since the 18th of November. And I don't think that's luck. I think it's because we move, and because we park where we can see, and because we don't run the generator after dark, and because a thing that is quiet and dark and in a different place every 3rd night doesn't get found the way a lit-up strongbox in a pullout gets found. Dell was right, and I'm going to keep saying it as long as she keeps refusing to. And here's what's coming, and it's not people, and it's not the sick, and it's not the winter. It's the 2 front tires, 4708 and 4708, 47th week of 2008. They've got maybe a third of their tread, and they look like tires. I check them cold every morning before we move, both fronts and all 6 rears, with a gauge I've had for 11 years. I run a piece of chalk along the sidewalls so I can see the cracking against the white. And there's cracking. Not deep. There's more of it in January than there was in December. There is one truck tire shop within reach, in Carrick, and it has been closed since the 16th of October, and its stock was gone before that. I've been in the lot. I've looked in the windows with my hands cupped against the glass. There are 4 tires in there, and they're all wrong sizes. And I know that because I went back a second time with a flashlight to be sure. The right rear spring pack has a cracked leaf, second from the top. I found it on the 9th of January doing a walk-around, and it's cracked clean through about 4 inches in from the eye, and the pack is still doing its job because there are 6 other leaves in it, and it will keep doing its job for a while, and I do not know how long a while is, and neither does anybody left alive within 61 miles. There are no parts. That's the whole ending if you want one. There's no supply chain for a leaf spring for a 1997 chassis, or a 15-year-old steer tire, or a water pump, or a belt. Everything we do now is about extending the life of one machine that cannot be replaced and that is, if we're honest about it, already old. So we drive slow. 40 is the limit now, on flat ground, in daylight. We don't take the Shielan at all anymore, ever for any reason, which cuts 18 miles and 2 water points out of our territory, and which is the price of my education. We don't carry a full water tank if we're moving more than 10 miles. I've taken 60 more pounds off the vehicle since December, in dribs, a jack here, a toolbox there, and I'll take more. Saul asked me in January whether I was sorry I built it. I told her the truth, which is that I'm sorry I bought steel instead of tires, and I'm sorry I never got the axle weights in July when the pads were 4 minutes away, and I'm sorry I didn't tell anybody about the brakes going long until the night before the grade. But I'm not sorry about the 11th of October. I sat in that vehicle for 40 minutes with my hands on my knees listening to somebody push on a door that did not open, and 5 people who are alive right now were behind that door, and I built it. Both those things are true and they don't cancel each other. I built a very good building. I bolted it to a chassis and then drove it up a hill. This morning it was 19 degrees. I was out at 5:40 with the flashlight in my teeth, checking the front's cold like I do, and the left one was down 4 pounds from Tuesday, which is probably the cold and probably not the valve. And I'll check it again tomorrow and the day after, and I'll know by Friday. Dell came out with coffee and stood there while I finished, and neither of us said anything. And behind her, through the open door, I could hear Milo and Saul arguing about something in the back, and Roscoe scratching at the dinette. We moved to the quarry at first light. That's 4 miles. Then Thursday to the packing shed. That's 11. Then the ridge, that's 9. 61 miles is the whole world now, and it holds together as long as 6 tires and 1 cracked spring and a 15-year-old set of steers hold together. And I'll be out there again tomorrow morning at 5:45 with the chalk and the gauge, because that's the job now. That's all of it. That's the entire job.